Right, so it's almost impressive watching Keir Starmer, and I'm rarely impressed by this man, as you know. The man who promised integrity instead leads the charge to outlaw the nation's conscience, especially where it comes to Israel and Gaza, and especially when it comes to protest over that. The government that can't regulate rent or energy prices has somehow found time to declare that protesting genocide is an act of terror, as the proscription of Palestine Action has shown. But actually, the problem goes far deeper than that. Universities are now spying on their students for the Israeli arms firms themselves. Police are arresting pensioners for holding up slogans, and the Home Office, having been turned into a graveyard of moral principle, has decided that the real threat to national security isn't those arms dealers or the war criminals they supply, but the people standing in front of them with banners. It'd be funny if it weren't so historically familiar. When the state runs out of arguments, it reaches for the handcuffs. When a democracy starts criminalising empathy, it's not defending itself, it's confessing. And in 2025, Keir Starmer's Britain is confessing very loudly indeed. Right, so we're going to begin this one in Lancashire, at the gates of the Salisbury Aerodrome, where the BAE Systems logo glints above the steel fences like a warning label. Here there be no morals. Yesterday, about 60 people stood before it, teachers, nurses, students, trade unionists, blockading the factory. And for 6 hours, one of Britain's most profitable weapons factories fell silent as a result. The Salisbury plant builds the rear fuselage for every F-35 fighter jet in the world. Those fuselages become part of the jets that Israel flies over Gaza. Everyone carries a barcode that traces back to Lancashire. Protesters call the site the kill chain. The British state calls it national security. Police described the process as peaceful. There were no arrests, no vandalism, just a line of people refusing complicity. But what happens outside those gates is larger than one demonstration, because it marks the collapse of a strategy that was supposed to scare the conscience out of all of us across Britain. As we know, Keir Starmer's government has used the Terrorism Act of 2000 to ban Palestine Action. The Salisbury Action was not them. There are plenty of other groups, aren't there? Protest will always find a way. You simply can't legislate it out of existence, no matter how much Keir Starmer might try. People will always protest regardless. The Home Office said it was a serious threat to public safety, but the real threat, of course, was the moral clarity and the fact they have no morals anymore. The activists' crime was to expose Britain's material role in a genocide that much of Westminster still pretends is no such thing. Salisbury and other incidents besides have proved the ban has backfired, a ban that may yet be overturned. Case is coming back to court next month. What the government thought it could outlaw has only multiplied. When the then Home Secretary Yvette Cooper stood before Parliament in July to announce their prescription, she did it with the bureaucratic detachment reserved for policy briefings and budget cuts. Palestine Action, she said, had engaged in criminal damage designed to coerce government. What, protesters trying to get governments to change their mind? I mean, what else are protests for exactly? But that phrase, coerce the government, was the grotesque heart of the argument, wasn't it? The government was describing public pressure itself as terrorism now. It was a statement that moral protest had become indistinguishable in the eyes of the state from physical violence. Perhaps we should just lobby them inside Parliament, but then we haven't got the money to throw at these ministers like other entities might. Legal scholars called it a constitutional perversion, which absolutely it was. I would think of other ways to call it, but that's a polite way. They pointed out that the Terrorism Act had been written to stop bombings, not banner drops. Yet the Labour government repurposed it to defend a weapons industry that supplies a state currently under investigation for plausible acts of genocide. And the result has been so predictable as a result. Within weeks, the numbers told the story. 890 people arrested in London for displaying articles in support of a proscribed organisation. Terrorists, among them were teachers and students and pensioners and the disabled. Proper terrorist-looking people. Their offence was wearing a t-shirt or a badge or holding up a cardboard sign with the words Palestine Action on it. And the Home Office used those arrests as justification for a new round of protest restrictions, the so-called repeat protest powers we've just heard about. New Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood doubling down on her predecessor's stupidity. The same week, London hosted the DSEI 2025 Arms Fair. 51 Israeli companies were permitted to exhibit there. Their missile systems and their drone components were displayed in polished glass booths just a few miles from where those arrests had taken place. No minister questioned the legality of that. No police raids were ordered on that. The contrast is frankly sickening. Peace was prosecuted, immoral profit protected. The ban was supposed to restore control in the eyes of this government. Instead, it's detonated in their hands, as it was always going to. What began as an attempt to brand Palestine solidarity as extremism has just exposed the extremism of Britain's own double standards. The proscription is failing because it misunderstood the nature of moral movements. Labour government, the Labour Party, no longer understands the meaning of protest, despite that party being born out of that. You can ban a group, but you can't ban the principle. Within weeks, new networks emerged to fill the void. More protests happen anyway, from Workers for a Free Palestine to Stop Arming Israel to local Palestine Solidarity Campaign branches, all filling the space that Palestine Action might have once occupied. The Samsbury blockade was their answer to that prescription. It wasn't orchestrated from above because it didn't need to be. It's the spontaneous reaction of ordinary people who understand the moral line has been crossed. Blow to the government and its overreach, we're not having it. The blockade halted production for 6 hours, shutting down a factory that makes the backbone of Israel's air campaign. Witnesses saw banners from Unite or the PCS or the UCU and NHS Workers for Palestine. There were engineering students from Manchester, lecturers from Lancashire, retired teachers from Preston and more besides. When police asked who the organiser was, one activist said simply, "Conscience is our organiser," which is precisely the right answer to that question. Or we are Spartacus. But that was the point, wasn't it? By banning an organisation, the state had decentralised the idea. Resistance no longer needed a name or hierarchy. It is a civic reflex. Sociologists call it the Hydra effect. Every act of suppression creates new heads of resistance. Samsbury proved the model worked. Protesters now combine meticulous legality with total defiance. They live stream actions, coordinate legal observers, and cite export licence data in real time. They know the law better than most of the officers enforcing it. And they also know that every arrest strengthens their argument. If non-violent protest is terrorism, then terrorism has no meaning left. The same pattern has been repeated elsewhere. In Sheffield, where another F-35 parts supplier, Forge Solutions Group, was blockaded. There have been similar scenes in the likes of Brighton and Newcastle and Glasgow in recent weeks. What the state imagined as deterrence through its clampdown of Palestine Action has become the template for mass participation instead. But the most chilling sign of how far this logic has spread through establishment ties came not from Westminster, not from the Starmeroids in charge, but from our universities now instead. An investigation headed by Liberty Investigates has obtained internal emails proving that several British universities have been monitoring their own students on behalf of arms manufacturers. Heriot-Watt in Edinburgh, Loughborough, Cardiff and Glasgow were among those that have been named. They tracked social media posts, monitored WhatsApp groups and flagged potential disruptions ahead of corporate events with defence contractors. One message showed Heriot-Watt's security chief promising to implement enhanced CCTV and social media monitoring for a Raytheon UK careers fair. Raytheon, of course, supplies missiles used by Israel and Gaza. The university claimed it was protecting safety, but what it was really protecting was its funding. Between late 2023 and early 2025, 37 universities had disciplined around 200 students and staff for pro-Palestine activism. Many were accused of bringing the university into disrepute. None were accused of violence, though. So this wasn't just moral cowardice, it was structural alignment. British universities have become so financially dependent on the arms trade now that this is what they're up to. Engineering and computer science faculties receive millions from the likes of BAE or Rolls-Royce or the MOD. Research projects in artificial intelligence, drone guidance and surveillance systems often carry dual-use contracts that serve both commercial and military ends. When students challenge that relationship, they are not confronting abstract policy. They're threatening revenue streams. In that light, the spying scandal isn't an anomaly, it's the logical extension of a system where every public institution now functions as part of Britain's security industrial complex and has ended up in that position through years and years of cuts into funding. Universities that once taught ethics are now enforcing obedience instead. The government didn't have to tell them to do it. The culture of fear and the economy of dependence did the job instead. Keir Starmer promised integrity when he entered Downing Street in July of last year. What he's delivered has been the continuity of his predecessors with added doses of significant authoritarianism. The Public Order Act remains untouched. The Palestine Action ban went ahead. Police powers have been expanded now under the justification of repeat protest control. The pattern is familiar. Call repression safety, call complicity security, and hope the public stops noticing the difference. Well, we're not going to. The political opposition has collapsed into consensus. Labour and the Conservatives now compete only on tone. Both defend arms exports as strategic necessity. Both describe Gaza as a complex situation. Both frame mass protest as a nuisance. And Reform UK go even further than that, practically humping Israel's leg like a particularly fruity Jack Russell. Meanwhile, the BBC reduces demonstrations of hundreds of thousands to a sentence about traffic disruption. Newspapers recycle police statements without question. The idea of moral journalism has been replaced by stenography. Even academia now, as this surveillance scandal now breaking is shown, now acts as an arm of state messaging. University press offices issue statements about tolerance and balance while quietly feeding student data to defence firms. Every layer of institutional Britain, political, media, academic, now move in unison around the same idea, that dissent is dangerous. The result is a country whose legality has outlived its morality. Exporting weapons to a state committing war crimes is legal. Objecting too loudly to that arrangement is not. The contradiction there is completely unsustainable. The more the government insists it is defending democracy, the more obviously it exposes its decay, and people aren't stupid, and they don't like it, and they will protest anyway. The numbers reinforce the point. BAE Systems recorded profits above £25 billion in 2025, driven by F-35 orders. The UK authorised over £500 million in arms sales to Israel between 2015 and 2024. Every law against protest protects those figures. The ban on Palestine Action was not about security, it was about shielding that revenue stream. The government's mistake is assuming fear still works, because it doesn't. Fear is effective only when obedience feels safe. But when people watch peaceful protesters being treated as terrorists, the fear just goes back in the other direction. They stop fearing protest and start fearing the state. And that shift is becoming more visible everywhere, in the growth of decentralised actions, in the solidarity networks forming between the likes of trade unions and student groups, in the rapid public backlash to every new police power. The sociologist Charles Tilley once said that social movements win when they occupy the moral ground the state claims for itself. The British government has vacated that ground entirely. Each arrest, each surveillance scandal, each corporate-funded university statement widens the gap between official virtue and public conscience. At that point, the state's power becomes performative. Laws passed for their symbolism rather than enforcement. The Public Order Act, the protest bans, the arrests under the Terrorism Act, all have become rituals of denial, attempts to reassert legitimacy through control. But every use of those powers is also an admission that persuasion has failed. The repression has therefore backfired on every level, legally, politically, and psychologically. The more the government clamps down, the clearer it becomes that it's not protecting democracy, but policing embarrassment. Britain's been here before. Every time the country confronts a moral reckoning, it reaches for repression. The suffragettes were called extremists. The anti-apartheid movement was labelled subversive. The miners were treated as insurgents. Every time the state mistook dissent for disorder and discovered, too late, that its legitimacy depended on the very people it was trying to silence. The pattern repeats because the underlying reflex never changes. When power runs out of arguments, it reaches for the police. The proscription of Palestine Action follows that historical record exactly. It's the empire turning inward, using colonial logic against its own citizens. It's the state saying you may vote, you may speak, but you may not disrupt the flow of weapons to our allies. Therefore, repression becomes confession. There's a cruel symmetry to what's happened here. The government banned a movement in order to destroy it, and in doing so, it's building a larger one. The 6-hour blockade at Samlesbury did more than stop a production line. It demonstrated that the state no longer controls the moral narrative, even after trying to make an example out of Palestine Action. The same banners that ministers hoped would stop popping up now appear at every march. The fact is, you can't prescribe us all. Otherwise, who else is going to be left to vote for you next time you need us? Every new law confirms the truth of that as protest continues regardless. Every expansion of surveillance, every arrest, every university scandal reinforces the argument that Britain's democracy has collapsed into managerial authoritarianism. What began as a campaign about Gaza has become a referendum on Britain's moral identity now. And people are voting with their feet and their placards, and they're locking on. The lesson of the last year is a simple one, but given Starmer's lot don't seem to get it, I'll try and dumb it down for their benefit. You can outlaw an organisation, but not the instinct to refuse injustice. You can call protest terrorism, but you cannot redefine compassion as crime and expect a society to remain sane. The proscription of Palestine Action, the arrest, the spying, none of it has restored order. Civic disorder through protest is our right, after all. It is not your right to strip us of it. It has only shown that the government is frightened of its own citizens. Britain's institutions, from Parliament to the lecture hall, are no longer moral authorities. They are security subcontractors. And so we need a massive reset that establishment parties will never deliver. The movement they tried to crush has survived because it does not depend on permission. It survives in the people who still know the difference between law and justice and between safety and silence. When future historians look back on this, they will not remember the ministerial statements or the legal definitions. They will remember that on a cold morning in Lancashire, ordinary people stood before the gates of BAE Systems and brought a piece of that war machine to a halt. They will remember that when Britain called empathy un-British, its citizens redefined what being British meant to them. The government can call it extremism all it likes. The press can call it disruption. The universities can call it misconduct. History will call it what it always is when decency confronts power. A beginning. Because repression doesn't end a movement. It exposes the guilt that created it. And the state can ban a name, but it cannot ban the heartbeat behind it. Starmer can't exactly talk much about what is un-British and what isn't these days anyway, when he decided to leave British citizens to Israel's mercies, as UK members of the Summit's Freedom Coalition became a matter for Israel and not the government, apparently. So much for British sovereignty, then, if Israel apparently has a veto over it. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.